Philosophy has long been concerned with the question of human happiness, seeking to understand what constitutes a fulfilling life and how one might achieve it. Among the many thinkers who have contributed to this discourse, Epicurus stands out as a philosopher who placed happiness at the very core of his teachings. Living in a time of political instability and philosophical competition, Epicurus developed a system of thought that sought to liberate individuals from fear and suffering, allowing them to achieve a state of tranquility and contentment. His philosophy, often misunderstood as mere hedonism, was in reality a nuanced and rational approach to achieving a life free from unnecessary pain and anxiety. The study of Epicurus is essential not only for understanding ancient Greek philosophy, but also for its relevance to modern life. In an era marked by stress, material excess, and existential uncertainty, his ideas continue to offer valuable insights into how we might structure our lives to attain lasting happiness. Epicurus' emphasis on simple pleasures, meaningful relationships, and freedom from fear presents an alternative to the relentless pursuit of wealth and status that dominates contemporary society. His teachings remind us that true happiness is not found in excess, but in balance and moderation. To fully appreciate the impact of Epicurus, one must first consider the intellectual and historical context in which he lived. Born in the late 4th century BCE, Epicurus was a product of an era in which the Greek world was experiencing profound change. The decline of the city-state polis as the central unit of political life and the rise of large empires created a sense of uncertainty and alienation among individuals. In response, philosophical schools such as Stoicism, skepticism, and Epicureanism emerged, each offering a path to inner peace in a rapidly changing world. While some philosophical traditions like Platonism and Aristotelianism focused on metaphysical speculation and political theory, Epicurus was primarily concerned with practical philosophy, how one should live in order to achieve happiness. His approach was deeply personal, aimed at individuals rather than the state or society as a whole. Unlike Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, which were institutions of formal education, Epicurus' garden was a community where philosophy was a way of life, open to all, including women and slaves, an uncommon practice in his time. Central to Epicurus' thought was the idea that happiness is achieved through the pursuit of pleasure, but not in the way hedonism is commonly understood. For Epicurus, pleasure was not about indulgence in material wealth, luxury, or fleeting sensual gratifications. Rather, he distinguished between different types of desires: natural and necessary desires, such as food, shelter, and friendship; natural but unnecessary desires, such as fine food and entertainment; and vain desires, such as wealth, fame, and power. By satisfying only the necessary desires and avoiding the pursuit of vain ones, an individual could attain a state of inner peace, known as ataraxia, freedom from mental disturbance. Another key aspect of Epicurus' philosophy was the rejection of fear, particularly the fear of gods and death. In a time when religious beliefs played a dominant role in human life, Epicurus sought to free people from the anxiety caused by superstition. He argued that the gods, if they existed, were indifferent to human affairs, and that death was simply the cessation of sensation, meaning there was nothing to fear. This rational approach to existential questions made Epicurus a controversial figure, as his views directly challenged the religious and philosophical traditions of his time. Epicurus also contributed significantly to scientific thought, adopting and expanding upon the atomic theory first proposed by Democritus. He believed that everything in the universe, including the soul, was composed of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms. This materialist view of the world eliminated the need for supernatural explanations, reinforcing his belief that human beings should rely on reason rather than myth or divine intervention. By understanding the natural workings of the universe, Epicurus argued, people could free themselves from irrational fears and live more fulfilling lives. Despite his influence, Epicurus' philosophy has often been misinterpreted. Many of his critics, particularly the Stoics and later Christian thinkers, portrayed him as a proponent of mindless pleasure-seeking, equating his philosophy with gluttony and excess. This misunderstanding led to the decline of Epicureanism in later centuries, as moral and religious doctrines emphasizing self-denial gained prominence. However, a closer examination of his writings and the accounts of his followers reveals a philosophy deeply concerned with wisdom, moderation, and personal well-being rather than reckless indulgence. The relevance of Epicurus in modern times cannot be overstated. In an age where consumerism, social comparison, and technological distractions dominate, his emphasis on simplicity, self-sufficiency, and genuine human connection provides a much-needed antidote to the anxieties of contemporary life. His ideas resonate with movements that promote minimalism, mindfulness, and well-being, demonstrating that the pursuit of happiness remains a fundamental human concern across the ages. The origins of a philosopher often provide valuable insight into the development of their ideas, and Epicurus is no exception. Born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, a Greek colony in the Aegean Sea, Epicurus was raised in a world shaped by the legacy of classical Athens and the emerging Macedonian dominance under Philip II and later Alexander the Great. This period of transition and political upheaval likely influenced his later focus on individual happiness and self-sufficiency, as traditional political structures became increasingly unstable. Epicurus was born into a modest family. His father, Neocles, was a schoolteacher, while his mother, Cheristrate, practiced religious rituals and incantations. Although not of aristocratic descent, his family's engagement with education and local traditions exposed Epicurus to early intellectual influences. His upbringing in Samos, a coastal island rich in cultural exchanges, also allowed him access to a variety of philosophical ideas, which would later shape his worldview. From a young age, Epicurus demonstrated a keen interest in philosophy. According to historical accounts, he was dissatisfied with the teachings of his school teachers, particularly concerning the origins of the universe. At the age of 14, he was said to have encountered a puzzling explanation about chaos and the world's creation, which he found unsatisfactory. This dissatisfaction ignited his intellectual curiosity and set him on a path toward philosophical inquiry. At the age of 18, Epicurus left Samos and traveled to Athens, the intellectual heart of Greece. During this period, Athens was still a vibrant center of learning, home to the academy founded by Plato and the Lyceum established by Aristotle. However, Epicurus arrived in the city at a time of political turbulence. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC led to conflicts among his successors, and the Athenian rebellion against Macedonian rule resulted in the expulsion of non-citizens, including Epicurus' family. This forced Epicurus to relocate to Colophon, a city in Asia Minor, where he continued his education. During his travels, Epicurus studied under several philosophers, each of whom contributed to the development of his thought. One of his first teachers was Pamphilus, a Platonist, but Epicurus quickly rejected Platonic idealism in favor of a more empirical and materialist approach. He later encountered the teachings of Democritus, who proposed that the universe was composed of indivisible particles called atoms. This atomic theory would become a fundamental pillar of Epicurean philosophy, shaping his views on nature, the soul, and human existence. Another significant influence on Epicurus was Nausiphanes, a follower of Democritus. From Nausiphanes, Epicurus inherited not only the atomic theory, but also a strong emphasis on skepticism toward traditional beliefs. However, he later distanced himself from his teacher, claiming to have developed his philosophical ideas independently. Epicurus' rejection of earlier philosophers, including Democritus and even Socrates, reflected his desire to construct a philosophy that was both practical and distinct from existing schools of thought. By the time he was in his late 20s, Epicurus had begun formulating his own philosophical system. He traveled to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos and later to Lampsacus, where he started teaching his ideas and gaining followers. His emphasis on the pursuit of happiness through simple pleasures and the elimination of fear attracted a growing number of adherents. These early experiences in teaching allowed Epicurus to refine his doctrines, preparing him for the establishment of his own school. Epicurus returned to Athens in 306 BC and marked a turning point in his life. Having developed a clear philosophical vision, he purchased a house with a garden, where he founded his school, known simply as the Garden. Unlike the academy or the lyceum, which were formal institutions, the garden functioned as a philosophical community where people from all walks of life, men, women, and even slaves, were welcome to engage in philosophical discourse. This radical inclusivity distinguished Epicurus from his contemporaries and reflected his belief that philosophy should serve as a guide to personal well-being rather than as an abstract or elitist pursuit. Throughout his early life, Epicurus displayed a deep commitment to intellectual independence and the practical application of philosophy. Unlike many of his predecessors, who focused on political theory, metaphysics, or dialectical reasoning, Epicurus sought to address the everyday concerns of human existence. His rejection of traditional religious fears, his embrace of atomism, and his insistence on the importance of pleasure as the highest good all stem from his early experiences and formative education. Epicurus' journey from a curious student to a revolutionary thinker illustrates the significance of both intellectual and personal development in the creation of a philosophical system. His willingness to challenge established doctrines and his ability to synthesize various influences into a coherent and practical worldview laid the foundation for what would become one of the most influential schools of thought in antiquity. The development of Epicurean philosophy was not a spontaneous event, but rather a process shaped by various intellectual influences and personal insights. Epicurus synthesized ideas from earlier philosophers while rejecting many of their conclusions, crafting a philosophical system centered on human happiness, rational inquiry, and the elimination of fear. His philosophy was both a theoretical framework and a practical guide to life, aiming to free individuals from unnecessary suffering and lead them to a state of lasting tranquility. One of the key influences on Epicurus was Democritus, the pre-Socratic philosopher known for developing the atomic theory of the universe. Democritus argued that everything in existence, including human beings, was composed of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms moving through empty space. This materialist perspective eliminated the need for supernatural explanations of the world, emphasizing a purely naturalistic view of existence. Epicurus adopted this atomic theory, but introduced a critical modification. He proposed that atoms occasionally swerve unpredictably, which allowed for the possibility of free will. This idea countered the strict determinism found in Democritus' philosophy, allowing Epicurus to argue that human beings were not entirely subject to fate. Another significant influence on Epicurus was Aristippus, a student of Socrates and the founder of the Cyrenaic school. Aristippus advocated for hedonism, the idea that pleasure is the highest good. However, Cyrenaic hedonism focused primarily on immediate and intense pleasures, often associated with bodily indulgence. Epicurus rejected this extreme view and instead proposed a more measured approach to pleasure. He distinguished between different types of pleasures, arguing that the highest form of pleasure was not found in excess, but in a state of ataraxia or freedom from mental distress. Epicurus' ethical framework was based on the idea that pleasure and pain are the fundamental guides to human behavior. He categorized desires into three types: natural and necessary desires, such as food, water, and shelter, which are essential for survival; natural but unnecessary desires, such as gourmet food and luxury, which provide pleasure but are not essential; and vain and empty desires, such as wealth, fame, and power, which lead to endless dissatisfaction. By fulfilling only natural and necessary desires and avoiding vain ones, individuals could achieve a life of contentment without being enslaved by material pursuits. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Epicurus did not believe that philosophy should be an abstract or purely intellectual exercise. Instead, he viewed it as a tool for achieving personal well-being. He argued that philosophy's purpose was to guide individuals toward a happier life by dispelling irrational fears, particularly the fear of gods and death. In his view, the common belief that the gods actively intervened in human affairs only led to unnecessary anxiety. By adopting a materialist understanding of the universe, Epicurus reassured his followers that the gods, if they existed, were indifferent to human concerns and played no role in determining one's fate. Epicurus also addressed the fear of death, which he saw as one of the greatest obstacles to happiness. He famously stated, "Death is nothing to us," arguing that when we are alive, death is absent, and when we are dead, we no longer exist to experience it. Since death entails the cessation of sensation, it should not be feared. This perspective provided a liberating view of mortality, allowing individuals to focus on enjoying life rather than worrying about what comes after it. Another important aspect of Epicurus' philosophy was his emphasis on friendship. Unlike the Stoics, who valued self-sufficiency and emotional detachment, Epicurus considered friendship one of the most essential components of a happy life. He believed that genuine friendships provided security, comfort, and shared joy, making them more valuable than wealth or power. In the garden, his philosophical community, Epicurus cultivated an environment where friendships flourished, reinforcing the idea that happiness is best achieved through meaningful relationships rather than social status or material success. Epicurus also developed a unique approach to knowledge and epistemology. He believed that all knowledge originates from sensory experience, arguing that the senses provide reliable information about the world. However, he also acknowledged that sensory perceptions could sometimes be misleading, which is why rational reflection was necessary to interpret experiences correctly. His empirical approach to knowledge aligned with his materialist worldview, reinforcing his belief that supernatural explanations were unnecessary. The simplicity of Epicurus' philosophy was one of its greatest strengths, but it also led to many misconceptions. Critics, particularly the Stoics and later Christian thinkers, often misrepresented Epicureanism as a doctrine of hedonistic excess, equating it with gluttony and debauchery. However, Epicurus himself lived a modest life, emphasizing moderation and intellectual pleasure over physical indulgence. His philosophy was not about reckless pleasure-seeking, but about carefully choosing which pleasures to pursue to maintain a tranquil state of mind. The formation of Epicurean philosophy marked a significant departure from other philosophical traditions of the time. Unlike Plato's idealism, which focused on abstract forms, or Aristotle's emphasis on virtue ethics and political engagement, Epicurus' philosophy was deeply personal and pragmatic. By prioritizing individual well-being and offering practical strategies for achieving happiness, Epicurus created a system that resonated with those seeking relief from the anxieties of daily life. His ideas, though controversial in his time, laid the foundation for a school of thought that would endure for centuries and continue to influence modern discussions on happiness, ethics, and the nature of existence. The establishment of the garden marked a turning point in Epicurus' philosophical journey. More than just a school of thought, the garden was a living embodiment of Epicurean philosophy, a sanctuary where individuals could cultivate happiness, pursue wisdom, and free themselves from unnecessary fears and desires. Unlike the formal institutions of Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, the garden functioned as a community where philosophy was not merely studied, but practiced as a way of life. Epicurus founded the garden in Athens around 306 BCE, after years of refining his philosophical doctrines. He acquired a house with an attached garden, a location that would lend its name to his school. Unlike the grand public spaces of other philosophical institutions, the garden was a private and peaceful retreat, reinforcing the Epicurean emphasis on tranquility and simplicity. The physical setting itself reflected the values of its founder, offering a refuge from the distractions and turmoil of the outside world. One of the most radical aspects of the garden was its inclusivity. In contrast to other philosophical schools, which were often restricted to wealthy men of aristocratic backgrounds, the garden welcomed individuals from all walks of life. Women, slaves, and foreigners were all accepted as equals, an unusual practice in ancient Greece. Epicurus believed that wisdom and the pursuit of happiness were not privileges reserved for a specific class, but fundamental rights accessible to everyone. This openness was a direct challenge to the elitism of other philosophical traditions. The garden functioned as more than a place of intellectual discourse. It was a close-knit community where members lived according to Epicurean principles. Unlike the Stoics, who emphasized duty and civic engagement, or the Platonists, who sought abstract knowledge, Epicureans believed that philosophy should be directly applicable to daily life. The community cultivated a lifestyle of moderation, self-sufficiency, and mutual support, allowing its members to focus on achieving ataraxia, a state of freedom from mental disturbance. A key aspect of life in the garden was the rejection of material excess. Epicurus himself lived modestly, consuming simple meals such as bread, cheese, and water. He argued that luxury and extravagance led to dependence on external factors for happiness, whereas a simple life cultivated contentment. By reducing desires to what was truly necessary for well-being, Epicureans believed they could attain a stable and lasting happiness, unaffected by external misfortunes. Friendship was another cornerstone of the garden's philosophy. Unlike other schools that prioritized civic duty or personal ambition, Epicurus placed immense value on close friendships. He argued that friendships provided security, companionship, and joy, making them essential for a fulfilling life. In the garden, friendships were cultivated through shared meals, philosophical discussions, and mutual care. The sense of belonging and emotional support offered by the community reinforced the Epicurean belief that happiness was best achieved through meaningful relationships rather than wealth or social status. Despite its peaceful and private nature, the garden faced opposition from critics. Many Athenians viewed the school with suspicion, in part due to its secluded nature and its rejection of traditional religious and civic obligations. The Epicurean dismissal of divine intervention and fear of death was perceived as a threat to conventional beliefs, and their rejection of political engagement was often misunderstood as selfishness or indifference. Detractors spread rumors that the garden was a place of hedonistic excess, though in reality, its members lived in moderation and simplicity. Another source of criticism stemmed from the perception that Epicurean philosophy encouraged withdrawal from society. Unlike the Stoics, who believed in actively participating in public life, Epicurus advised his followers to live unnoticed, leibiosis, meaning that one should avoid political entanglements and the pursuit of fame. He believed that political ambition led to unnecessary anxiety and conflict, distracting individuals from the true goal of life, achieving inner peace. However, this did not mean that Epicureans were completely detached from society. They still engaged in friendships, intellectual discussions, and daily activities, but they prioritized personal well-being over political power. Despite these criticisms, the garden flourished and attracted many followers across the Greek world. Epicurus wrote extensively, producing over 300 works, though only a few fragments and letters have survived. His teachings were passed down through generations, and his philosophy continued to spread beyond Athens. The garden became not just a school, but a movement, influencing thinkers in Greece and Rome who sought a life free from fear and full of simple joys. The founding of the garden was more than the establishment of a philosophical school. It was a revolutionary experiment in communal living and the practical application of philosophical principles. By rejecting the hierarchical structures of other institutions and embracing a lifestyle centered on simplicity, friendship, and intellectual inquiry, Epicurus created a lasting legacy. His philosophy provided a refuge for those seeking happiness outside of political and material ambitions, and the principles of the garden continue to resonate in discussions about well-being and the pursuit of a meaningful life. At the heart of Epicurean philosophy lies a fundamental question: what is the purpose of life? Epicurus answered this question with clarity and conviction. Human life should be oriented toward achieving happiness, which he defined as the absence of pain and the attainment of pleasure. However, his concept of pleasure was far more nuanced than the common interpretation of indulgence or excess. Unlike the hedonistic views of earlier philosophers such as Aristippus, Epicurus developed a sophisticated ethical system that sought to identify which pleasures led to genuine well-being and which resulted in suffering. For Epicurus, the highest goal of life was ataraxia, a state of inner tranquility and freedom from mental disturbance. This idea was central to his ethical framework. Unlike transient pleasures, which often come with hidden costs or long-term consequences, ataraxia was a stable and enduring state of contentment. It was achieved not through an endless pursuit of pleasures, but by strategically selecting those that contributed to a balanced and untroubled life. Epicurus made an important distinction between different types of pleasures. He categorized them into two main groups: kinetic pleasures, which involve active stimulation, such as eating delicious food, engaging in conversation, or listening to music, and static pleasures, which refer to a state of satisfaction when a desire has been fulfilled, such as feeling content after a meal or experiencing peace of mind when no pain is present. While kinetic pleasures were enjoyable, Epicurus believed that static pleasures were more important for achieving lasting happiness, as they represented a stable condition rather than a fleeting experience. Additionally, Epicurus divided human desires into three categories: natural and necessary desires, such as food, water, and shelter, which are essential for survival and should be satisfied in moderation; natural but unnecessary desires, such as luxury food, fine clothing, or entertainment, which can bring enjoyment but are not essential; and vain and empty desires, such as wealth, fame, and power, which are artificial constructs that ultimately lead to dissatisfaction. By focusing only on fulfilling natural and necessary desires, individuals could free themselves from the constant anxiety and frustration that come with pursuing wealth or social status. One of the most radical aspects of Epicurus' ethical philosophy was his rejection of traditional notions of morality based on external authorities, divine commandments, or societal expectations. Instead, he grounded ethics in human nature, arguing that moral behavior should be guided by its ability to promote happiness and reduce suffering. Unlike the Stoics, who believed virtue was an end in itself, Epicurus saw virtue as a means to achieving a pleasurable life. A person should be just, honest, and kind not because of rigid moral obligations, but because these qualities foster peaceful relationships and prevent unnecessary conflict. Epicurus also challenged the traditional Greek belief that happiness required political engagement or public recognition. Many Greek philosophers, including Aristotle, argued that human beings were naturally political creatures who could only achieve fulfillment through active participation in civic life. Epicurus, however, viewed political ambition as a source of stress, anxiety, and danger. He advised his followers to avoid politics whenever possible, believing that personal peace was far more valuable than public honor. His famous phrase, "Leve bioses, live unnoticed," encapsulated his belief that a quiet, private life was the best path to happiness. Furthermore, Epicurus' ethical philosophy extended to interpersonal relationships. He placed great emphasis on the role of friendship in achieving a fulfilled life. Unlike romantic love or familial obligations, which could sometimes be sources of emotional turmoil, true friendship was based on mutual respect, trust, and shared wisdom. Epicurus even suggested that friendship could replace family ties, as bonds formed by choice were often stronger than those determined by birth. The community of the garden was structured around these values, fostering an environment where friendships flourished and personal happiness was prioritized. Epicurus' views on pleasure and happiness also led him to reject the fear of death, which he saw as one of the greatest obstacles to living a peaceful life. He argued that death was nothing to be feared because when it arrives, we no longer exist to experience it. Since all sensation and consciousness cease with death, there is no pain or suffering to endure. This perspective freed his followers from existential anxiety and encouraged them to focus on making the most of their present lives rather than worrying about an afterlife. Despite the practicality and accessibility of Epicurean ethics, his ideas were frequently misunderstood. Many of his critics, including the Stoics and later Christian thinkers, misrepresented his advocacy of pleasure as crude hedonism. They accused Epicurus of promoting debauchery and indulgence, failing to recognize the discipline and moderation central to his philosophy. In reality, Epicurus lived a remarkably austere life, emphasizing simplicity and self-control as the key to true pleasure. Epicurus' ethical philosophy remains one of the most enduring aspects of his intellectual legacy. By redefining pleasure as a state of mental tranquility rather than indulgence, he provided a framework for achieving sustainable happiness. His insights continue to influence modern discussions on well-being, self-sufficiency, and the importance of mental health. Epicurus' ethical teachings were deeply connected to his understanding of nature and the universe. Unlike many philosophers of his time, who attributed cosmic events to divine intervention or mystical forces, Epicurus championed a rational and scientific approach to the natural world. His materialist perspective, largely inspired by Democritus' atomic theory, provided a framework for understanding existence without resorting to superstition. This scientific outlook was crucial to Epicurean philosophy, as it aimed to dispel irrational fears, particularly those related to gods, fate, and death, that often disturbed human happiness. At the core of Epicurus' natural philosophy was the belief that everything in the universe consists of atoms and void. He adopted this idea from Democritus, but made significant modifications. According to Epicurus, atoms are small, indivisible particles that move through empty space, forming everything from the stars to human bodies. Unlike Democritus, who believed atomic motion was strictly determined by mechanical laws, Epicurus introduced the concept of the swerve, a spontaneous and unpredictable deviation in an atom's path. This seemingly minor addition had profound philosophical implications, as it allowed for the existence of free will. By rejecting strict determinism, Epicurus preserved the idea that human beings were not entirely subject to fate, but had control over their actions and choices. One of Epicurus' main goals was to free people from the fear of divine intervention. Many ancient Greeks believed that natural disasters, diseases, and misfortunes were punishments from the gods. Epicurus, however, argued that the gods, if they existed, lived in a state of perfect happiness and had no interest in human affairs. Since they were free from desires and suffering, they had no reason to interfere in the world or demand worship. This view provided great comfort to his followers, allowing them to live without the anxiety of divine retribution. Epicurus also sought to eliminate the fear of death and the afterlife, which he saw as one of the greatest sources of human distress. According to his materialist philosophy, the soul was composed of atoms just like the body. When a person died, these atoms dispersed and consciousness ceased to exist. Since there was no afterlife, no punishment, no suffering, and no awareness, there was nothing to fear. This idea was summarized in his famous saying, "Death is nothing to us." By embracing this perspective, individuals could focus on making the most of their finite lives rather than worrying about an existence beyond death. Epicurus' rejection of fate also set him apart from many of his philosophical contemporaries. Unlike the Stoics, who believed in a rational, predetermined universe governed by divine reason, logos, Epicurus argued that natural phenomena were the result of atomic interactions, not destiny or divine will. This view reinforced the idea that human beings were the architects of their own happiness. Rather than resigning themselves to fate, individuals could take active steps to cultivate a life free from fear and unnecessary suffering. Another crucial aspect of Epicurean natural philosophy was his explanation of celestial bodies and weather phenomena. In his time, many people believed that eclipses, comets, and thunderstorms were signs from the gods. Epicurus countered these superstitions with rational explanations. He proposed multiple natural causes for these events, emphasizing that even if people could not determine the exact mechanism, they should not assume divine intervention. This method of reasoning, offering natural explanations while rejecting supernatural causes, was a forerunner of modern scientific thinking. Epicurus also applied his materialist philosophy to the question of life beyond Earth. He speculated that the universe was infinite and contained countless other worlds, some of which could be inhabited. This idea, remarkable for its time, anticipated later scientific developments in cosmology and the search for extraterrestrial life. By recognizing the vastness of the universe, Epicurus further diminished the significance of human concerns, reinforcing the idea that people should focus on achieving happiness in their own lives rather than worrying about cosmic mysteries. His empirical approach to knowledge was another cornerstone of his natural philosophy. Epicurus believed that sensory perception was the foundation of all knowledge. While he acknowledged that the senses could sometimes be deceived, he argued that reason and careful observation could help correct errors. This emphasis on empirical evidence distinguished him from philosophers like Plato, who believed that true knowledge could only be accessed through abstract reasoning and contemplation of ideal forms. Instead, Epicurus encouraged direct engagement with the natural world, relying on observation and logical inference to develop his theories. Despite the scientific nature of his philosophy, Epicurus' ideas were often misrepresented by his opponents. Many accused him of atheism, a charge that carried serious social and political consequences in ancient Greece. However, Epicurus never denied the existence of gods. He simply redefined their role, arguing that they were indifferent to human affairs. His teachings posed a challenge to traditional religious institutions, which relied on fear and superstition to maintain control over society. As a result, many religious and philosophical opponents sought to discredit him, portraying his school as irreverent and immoral. Epicurus' philosophy of nature laid the foundation for a rational and scientific worldview that sought to replace fear with understanding. By explaining the workings of the universe through natural causes rather than supernatural forces, he empowered individuals to live without anxiety about divine punishment, fate, or the afterlife. His emphasis on free will, empirical knowledge, and materialism influenced not only later philosophical traditions, but also modern scientific thought. Despite the depth and originality of Epicurus' philosophical system, his ideas were met with significant criticism, both during his lifetime and in the centuries that followed. Many of his contemporaries, particularly from rival philosophical schools, sought to discredit him by misrepresenting his teachings. While some opposition was based on genuine philosophical disagreements, much of it stemmed from misunderstandings and deliberate distortions of his views. Over time, these misconceptions contributed to the marginalization of Epicureanism, despite its profound impact on later thought. One of the most common and enduring criticisms of Epicurus was that his philosophy promoted hedonism in its most crude and indulgent form. His emphasis on pleasure as the highest good led many to believe that he encouraged reckless indulgence in food, drink, and sensual pleasures. This was especially propagated by the Stoics, who valued discipline, duty, and self-restraint over personal enjoyment. However, as previously discussed, Epicurus' notion of pleasure was not about excess, but about achieving ataraxia, a state of tranquility and freedom from mental disturbance. He advocated for moderation, simple living, and the careful selection of pleasures that would contribute to lasting well-being rather than fleeting gratification. Another major point of opposition came from religious and traditionalist thinkers who were disturbed by Epicurus' rejection of divine intervention. In a society where gods played a central role in political and moral life, his claim that the gods were indifferent to human affairs was viewed as dangerous. His materialist explanation of the universe, which eliminated the need for supernatural forces, challenged deeply held beliefs. Many religious figures saw his ideas as subversive, fearing that they would undermine social order and morality. This concern persisted well into the Christian era, where Epicureanism was often condemned as atheistic and immoral. Epicurus' opposition to political engagement also drew criticism, particularly from philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who believed that humans were naturally political beings. The Stoics, in particular, argued that one had a duty to participate in civic life and contribute to the well-being of the state. By contrast, Epicurus advised his followers to live unnoticed, laevbiosis, avoiding political ambition and public affairs in order to preserve inner peace. His detractors interpreted this as selfishness or indifference to society's problems, though in reality, Epicurus was not against social life. He simply believed that true happiness was best pursued in a private, stable community rather than in the chaotic world of politics. Another misunderstanding arose from the structure of the garden, which was unlike other philosophical schools of the time. While Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum were formal institutions with clear hierarchies and academic rigor, the garden was more of a communal space where philosophy was practiced as a way of life. The inclusion of women, slaves, and foreigners as equals also made the garden appear unorthodox to many Greeks, who viewed such inclusivity with suspicion. Rumors circulated that the garden was a place of moral corruption and indulgence, though there was no real evidence to support these claims. Epicurus' reliance on empirical knowledge and the senses also put him at odds with other philosophical traditions, particularly Platonism. Plato's theory of form suggested that true knowledge could only be acquired through reason and contemplation of ideal realities beyond the physical world. Epicurus, on the other hand, believed that all knowledge came from sensory perception and experience. While he acknowledged that the senses could sometimes be deceptive, he argued that they were still the most reliable means of understanding reality. This epistemological stance led to further philosophical opposition, particularly from those who saw reason and abstract thought as superior to empirical observation. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca was among those who criticized Epicurus, though he also showed a degree of respect for certain aspects of his teachings. While Seneca disagreed with the Epicurean emphasis on pleasure as the highest good, he admired Epicurus' focus on simplicity and self-sufficiency. He even quoted Epicurus on several occasions, acknowledging the wisdom of his teachings on friendship and moderation. This complex relationship between Stoicism and Epicureanism highlights the nuanced nature of philosophical disagreements in antiquity. While some criticisms were harsh and misrepresentative, others recognized the value of Epicurus' insights. As Christianity rose to prominence in the late Roman Empire, Epicureanism faced even greater opposition. Christian theologians, including Augustine of Hippo, saw Epicurean materialism and its denial of an afterlife as fundamentally incompatible with Christian doctrine. The Epicurean belief that death was simply the dissolution of the body and soul directly contradicted the Christian idea of eternal salvation or damnation. Furthermore, Epicurus claimed that the gods, if they existed, did not concern themselves with human affairs clashed with the Christian concept of a personal, interventionist God. As a result, many Christian thinkers sought to suppress or discredit Epicureanism, associating it with atheism and moral decay. Despite these criticisms, Epicureanism retained a strong following for centuries, particularly in the Roman world. The poet Lucretius, in his epic work De Rerum Natura, preserved and expanded upon Epicurean thought, presenting it as a rational and liberating philosophy. However, as Christianity became the dominant intellectual force in the West, Epicurean texts were lost or destroyed, leading to a decline in its influence. It was not until the Renaissance, with the rediscovery of De Rerum Natura, that Epicurean ideas began to resurface and influence modern philosophical and scientific thought. In retrospect, much of the opposition to Epicurus arose from misunderstandings, deliberate distortions, or ideological conflicts. His philosophy was neither hedonistic in the vulgar sense nor socially irresponsible. Instead, it offered a profound and practical guide to achieving happiness through reason, moderation, and the rejection of unnecessary fears. Although Epicureanism faced significant criticism and decline after the rise of Christianity, its ideas were never completely erased from intellectual history. The survival of Epicurean thought was due in large part to the efforts of Roman thinkers, the rediscovery of ancient texts during the Renaissance, and the philosophical developments of the modern era. Despite centuries of misrepresentation and suppression, Epicurus' teachings on happiness, materialism, and the nature of the universe continued to inspire thinkers across different periods. One of the most important figures in the preservation of Epicureanism was the Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius. In the 1st century BCE, Lucretius wrote his epic poem De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, which provided a detailed and poetic account of Epicurus' philosophy. In this work, Lucretius defended the atomic theory of nature, argued against the fear of death, and criticized religious superstition. De Rerum Natura became one of the most important sources for understanding Epicurean thought, as many of Epicurus' original writings were lost over time. Without Lucretius, much of Epicurus' philosophy might have been forgotten. Despite Lucretius' contributions, Epicureanism struggled to maintain influence during the rise of the Roman Empire. The Stoics, who emphasized duty, virtue, and acceptance of fate, became the dominant philosophical school among Roman elites. Figures such as Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius criticized Epicureanism for what they perceived as its excessive focus on pleasure and avoidance of hardship. Moreover, as Christianity spread, the Epicurean view of the gods as indifferent beings, along with its rejection of an afterlife, made it a target for religious opposition. Christian theologians such as Augustine of Hippo dismissed Epicurus as an immoral atheist, further pushing his philosophy into obscurity. For centuries, much of Epicurus' original work was lost, and his teachings survived only in fragments or indirect references. However, during the Renaissance, a period of renewed interest in ancient philosophy, Epicureanism was revived. The key moment in this revival came in 1417, when the Italian scholar Poggio Bracciolini discovered a manuscript of De Rerum Natura in a monastery. This rediscovery reintroduced Epicurean ideas to a European intellectual climate that was beginning to question religious dogma and explore humanism, science, and reason. With the Renaissance came a shift in philosophical and scientific thinking, and Epicurus' materialism found new relevance. The emphasis on empirical observation, as seen in the works of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, echoed Epicurus' belief in the importance of sensory experience and natural causes. His rejection of superstition and divine intervention aligned with the emerging scientific worldview, which sought to explain phenomena through reason and experimentation rather than religious doctrine. In the Enlightenment, Epicureanism gained further traction, influencing major thinkers such as Pierre Gassendi, a 17th-century French philosopher who sought to reconcile Epicurean atomism with Christianity. Gassendi revived Epicurus' materialist explanations of the universe and introduced them to a new audience, helping shape early modern science. Meanwhile, John Locke and Thomas Jefferson were also influenced by Epicurean thought. Jefferson, in particular, considered himself an Epicurean, believing that the pursuit of happiness was a fundamental human right, a view that found its way into the Declaration of Independence. The rise of modern utilitarianism, particularly through the works of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, also reflected Epicurean influences. Utilitarianism, which argues that the greatest happiness for the greatest number should be the guiding principle of morality, shared similarities with Epicurus' ethical system. While Bentham focused on maximizing pleasure in a quantitative sense, Mill recognized the importance of intellectual and moral pleasures, which paralleled Epicurus' distinction between different types of pleasure. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Epicurus' ideas continued to influence debates on materialism, atheism, and secular ethics. The growing acceptance of scientific explanations for natural phenomena further diminished the role of supernatural beliefs in human thought, aligning with Epicurus' vision of a universe governed by natural laws. Meanwhile, existentialist and humanist thinkers, including Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell, found value in Epicurus' rejection of fear-based morality and his emphasis on personal well-being. Today, Epicureanism remains relevant in discussions about happiness, mental health, and the meaning of life. Modern psychology has confirmed that excessive desires and external pressures can lead to anxiety and dissatisfaction, an insight that Epicurus recognized over 2,000 years ago. The principles of minimalism, mindfulness, and self-sufficiency, now popular in contemporary lifestyle movements, reflect Epicurus' belief that true happiness comes from simplicity, meaningful relationships, and the absence of unnecessary fears. Although Epicurus was often misrepresented as a hedonist or an atheist, his philosophy was far more nuanced and practical than his critics acknowledged. His emphasis on rationality, scientific inquiry, and the pursuit of happiness laid the groundwork for many modern intellectual movements. Despite the challenges and misconceptions he faced, Epicurus' legacy endures, continuing to inspire those who seek a life of peace, knowledge, and fulfillment. Epicurus' philosophy, though rooted in ancient Greek thought, continues to have a profound influence on contemporary discussions in philosophy, psychology, and even politics. His teachings on happiness, the nature of pleasure, the rejection of irrational fears, and the importance of rational inquiry remain deeply relevant in the modern world. From the psychological benefits of simplicity to the ethical implications of seeking pleasure without excess, Epicureanism offers valuable insights into how we can live meaningful and fulfilling lives today. One of the most significant areas where Epicureanism has gained relevance is in the field of psychology, particularly in relation to happiness and well-being. Modern psychology has validated many of the principles Epicurus espoused, especially his emphasis on the importance of inner tranquility and contentment. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition that happiness does not come from external circumstances or material wealth, but rather from mental states such as gratitude, mindfulness, and emotional regulation. Epicurus was ahead of his time in understanding that the pursuit of external goods and pleasures can lead to frustration, while cultivating inner peace and appreciating simple pleasures are key to lasting happiness. Epicurus' idea of ataraxia, a state of serene calmness and freedom from anxiety, has been embraced by modern therapeutic approaches such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. CBT focuses on helping individuals recognize and challenge irrational thoughts that contribute to emotional distress. This approach mirrors Epicurus' idea that many fears and anxieties, such as the fear of death or divine punishment, are based on misconceptions and can be eliminated through rational thought. Moreover, the Epicurean focus on managing desires and cultivating simple pleasures is echoed in contemporary mindfulness practices, which advocate for appreciating the present moment and reducing attachment to fleeting desires. Another modern application of Epicureanism can be found in the realm of ethics and morality. In contrast to ethical systems that prioritize duty or abstract ideals, Epicurus' ethical philosophy is grounded in the practical goal of achieving happiness. His emphasis on hedonism, however, is not about indulgence in excess, but rather the pursuit of pleasure in moderation, the avoidance of pain, and the cultivation of contentment. This concept has found its echo in contemporary utilitarianism, particularly in the works of philosophers like John Stuart Mill and Peter Singer. Mill, in his version of utilitarianism, distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, similar to Epicurus' distinction between pleasures that contribute to long-term well-being and those that lead to fleeting satisfaction. The modern ethical focus on the maximization of happiness for the greatest number mirrors the central tenets of Epicurean thought. Moreover, Epicureanism's materialist view of the world, grounded in the atomistic theory of nature, also finds resonance in the scientific worldview of the modern era. The development of modern physics, particularly quantum mechanics and atomic theory, has validated many of the ideas Epicurus proposed. His belief that everything in the universe is made up of atoms and that natural phenomena could be explained through rational, material causes rather than supernatural forces is consistent with contemporary scientific understanding. Epicurus' rejection of divine intervention in the natural world, along with his emphasis on empirical observation as the basis for knowledge, has become a foundational principle in modern science, which operates on the premise that phenomena are explained by natural laws rather than supernatural explanations. Epicurus' rejection of an afterlife and his assertion that death is nothing to us has also gained renewed significance in modern times, especially in discussions related to death anxiety and existential philosophy. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus grappled with the meaning of life in a world without inherent purpose, echoing Epicurus' claim that death marks the end of consciousness and, therefore, is not something to fear. Furthermore, the rise of secular humanism, which seeks to build meaning and ethics without reference to the divine or the afterlife, aligns with Epicurus' emphasis on living a life of pleasure, rationality, and moderation within the constraints of our finite existence. For many, Epicurus' arguments against the fear of death provide a liberating perspective, allowing individuals to focus on creating fulfilling lives in the here and now. Epicurus' ideas have not only influenced philosophy, but also made their way into political thought. His vision of a life of moderation, simple pleasures, and the avoidance of unnecessary desires can be seen as a precursor to modern minimalism and sustainability movements. Today, in a world often dominated by consumerism and material excess, many individuals and organizations are beginning to question the value of overconsumption and are advocating for a more balanced, less resource-intensive lifestyle. Epicurus' teachings on finding happiness through simplicity rather than accumulation of wealth resonate with these modern movements, which stress the importance of reducing waste, living more intentionally, and focusing on meaningful human relationships rather than material possessions. The rise of mental health awareness in recent years also highlights the relevance of Epicurus' thought. As more people struggle with anxiety, depression, and the pressures of modern life, the pursuit of peace of mind, one of the central tenets of Epicureanism, has gained renewed importance. Epicurus' emphasis on cultivating a life free from unnecessary worries, desires, and fears provides valuable guidance for individuals seeking ways to manage stress and anxiety. Practices like meditation and mindfulness, which promote self-awareness and emotional regulation, closely mirror Epicurus' prescriptions for achieving ataraxia and a tranquil state of mind. One area where Epicurus' teachings are still frequently misunderstood is his attitude toward pleasure. While critics often accuse him of advocating for indulgence in sensual pleasures, Epicurus himself was clear that the pursuit of pleasure should be balanced with the avoidance of pain and the cultivation of wisdom. In modern terms, this aligns with the idea of delayed gratification, understanding that the temporary discomfort of self-restraint often leads to greater long-term happiness. Epicurus believed that intellectual pleasures, such as friendship, learning, and the appreciation of beauty, were far more enduring and valuable than physical indulgence. This distinction between higher and lower pleasures is increasingly relevant in modern discussions about the nature of well-being, which emphasize emotional and intellectual fulfillment over material consumption. The modern relevance of Epicureanism lies in its practical, rational approach to life's fundamental challenges. Epicurus' teachings offer timeless insights into the nature of happiness, the pursuit of pleasure, and the importance of cultivating a peaceful, meaningful life. In a world that is often defined by uncertainty, anxiety, and the pressure to conform to societal expectations, Epicurus' philosophy offers a path to personal fulfillment that remains just as valuable today as it was in ancient Greece. Epicurus' philosophy, despite being criticized, misunderstood, and suppressed throughout much of history, has left an indelible mark on intellectual traditions across the world. His teachings on the nature of happiness, the importance of pleasure, and the need for rational thought and self-sufficiency have influenced a broad range of disciplines from ethics to science and continue to shape contemporary discussions on well-being, materialism, and the human condition. The enduring appeal of Epicureanism lies in its combination of empirical inquiry, ethical clarity, and practical wisdom, a philosophy that remains relevant for anyone seeking a life of peace, fulfillment, and meaning. One of the most profound aspects of Epicurus' legacy is his ethics of pleasure. While often mischaracterized as hedonistic or self-indulgent, his ethical framework was deeply concerned with achieving a balanced and serene life. Epicurus argued that the pursuit of pleasure, understood as the absence of pain and mental disturbance, was the highest good. However, this pursuit was not about indulgence in fleeting, sensory experiences, but about finding joy in simplicity, tranquility, and rational reflection. This emphasis on moderation and self-control continues to inform modern discussions about happiness, from the practices of mindfulness to the ethical debates around consumerism and sustainability. Epicurus' focus on cultivating intellectual pleasures, meaningful relationships, and freedom from fear is increasingly seen as a valuable antidote to the stress and superficiality that often characterize modern life. Epicurus' rejection of divine intervention and his naturalistic explanation of the universe also contributed to the development of modern science. His atomistic theory of nature, which posited that everything in the universe is composed of indivisible particles in constant motion, laid the groundwork for later scientific advancements in physics and biology. Although the specific details of Epicurus' atomic theory were later refined and modified, The basic idea that natural phenomena could be explained by material causes and laws has become a cornerstone of modern scientific inquiry. His empirical method, grounded in sensory observation and rational analysis, was a precursor to the scientific method that would later dominate Western thought. The naturalism that Epicurus championed continues to inform fields as diverse as biology, physics, and evolutionary theory. Furthermore, Epicurus' materialism, which denied the existence of an immaterial soul and rejected the idea of an afterlife, paved the way for secular humanism. In a world where religion and metaphysical beliefs often shape ethical and political systems, Epicurus offered a radically different perspective: that humans could live meaningful lives grounded in reason, compassion, and personal well-being without relying on supernatural or divine authority. This idea laid the foundation for secular movements that emphasize human dignity, rights, and happiness as central to moral life. The Enlightenment, which emphasized reason, individual rights, and the rejection of dogma, was significantly shaped by Epicurean thought, even though many of the intellectual leaders of the movement did not directly acknowledge his influence. His legacy, in this sense, is a philosophical and cultural shift that allowed for the flourishing of reason, democracy, and humanism in a modern world. In addition to his influence on science and secularism, Epicurus' focus on mental health and the elimination of unnecessary fears continues to resonate with contemporary psychological thought. The modern field of psychology, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, echoes many of Epicurus' key insights into human well-being. By teaching individuals to recognize and challenge irrational fears and desires, CBT helps people achieve greater emotional resilience and tranquility, goals that were central to Epicurus' ethical project. The recognition that fear of death, fear of gods, and fear of the unknown are often the root causes of anxiety aligns with Epicurus' belief that such fears could be overcome through reason. The growing field of positive psychology, which focuses on the science of happiness and well-being, also reflects Epicurus' emphasis on cultivating positive mental states, such as gratitude, mindfulness, and the appreciation of life's simple pleasures. Epicurus' ideas have also found a place in modern political philosophy, particularly in the context of personal freedom and the pursuit of happiness. His rejection of political involvement in favor of private life can be interpreted as an early form of libertarian thought, which emphasizes the rights of individuals to pursue their own happiness and well-being free from unnecessary interference. The idea that the state should not impose arbitrary moral or religious restrictions on personal lives is central to modern political debates surrounding issues such as freedom of expression, individual rights, and personal autonomy. The American Revolution, for example, was influenced by Enlightenment ideas about liberty and happiness, many of which can be traced back to Epicurean principles. In the realm of political ethics, Epicurus' vision of a society where individuals are free to seek happiness without fear or coercion has been integral to the development of liberal democratic ideals. Another significant aspect of Epicurus' legacy is his philosophy of friendship. For Epicurus, friendships were not just a means to achieve happiness, but a central component of a well-lived life. He believed that true friends help one attain tranquility, offer emotional support, and provide a sense of shared joy. This view of friendship as essential to human well-being has been confirmed by modern social science, which has demonstrated the profound effects that social connections have on mental and physical health. Research shows that people with strong social support networks tend to live longer, experience less stress, and have higher levels of overall happiness. Epicurus' understanding of friendship as a source of emotional and psychological security is just as relevant today as it was in the ancient world. Epicurus' legacy also persists in the growing emphasis on simplicity and minimalism in contemporary culture. In a world that increasingly values material accumulation, the Epicurean idea of finding contentment in simplicity and reducing unnecessary desires is gaining traction. Movements such as minimalism and voluntary simplicity advocate for living with less in order to focus on what truly matters, such as personal fulfillment, relationships, and inner peace. Epicurus' belief that true happiness comes from cultivating moderate pleasures and freeing oneself from the desire for wealth, power, or status resonates with the contemporary desire to live more intentionally and with greater mindfulness. The modern resurgence of secularism and atheism, particularly in the Western world, also points to the lasting influence of Epicurus. As more people identify as non-religious and question traditional religious doctrines, Epicurus' atheistic stance and his view of the universe as a naturalistic system governed by laws of cause and effect become increasingly relevant. His ideas provide a framework for understanding life without the need for supernatural explanations or the fear of divine retribution. As secularism becomes more prominent in public discourse, Epicurus' vision of a universe free from divine interference continues to resonate with those seeking a rational, fulfilling approach to life. Epicurus' teachings, often misunderstood or misrepresented in the past, have had a profound impact on modern intellectual thought. His ideas on happiness, ethics, the nature of the universe, and the importance of rational inquiry have shaped the course of philosophy, psychology, science, and politics. Today, his philosophy offers a practical guide to living a life of contentment, wisdom, and tranquility. The enduring legacy of Epicurus reminds us that the pursuit of happiness is not about the accumulation of wealth or external achievements, but about cultivating a life of moderation, meaningful connections, and inner peace. In a world still grappling with anxiety, consumerism, and existential uncertainty, the timeless wisdom of Epicurus continues to guide those who seek a life of fulfillment in the here and now.